Hey everyone, welcome back to Revenge Reloaded. The Tuesday I got laid off happened in a sterile corporate meeting. I was thanked for my contributions while they slid the severance packet across the table like it somehow cushioned the blow. I went home and handled the adult stuff first. I checked my balances, polished my resume, and convinced myself I'd bounce back. What my family had no idea about was that when my sister casually paid $500 to speed up my eviction and my parents refused to offer me shelter, calling it motivation, one quiet call to my grandmother's attorney would uncover a hidden inheritance and flip their comfortable lives upside down forever. My name is Suzanne Reed, and I'm 28. I got laid off on a Tuesday. Clean. Corporate. The kind where they thank you for your contributions and act like severance softens the fall. I went home and did the responsible things first. I checked my bank app, updated my resume, and told myself I'd land on my feet. 2 days later, my landlord reached out and said we needed to talk. I assumed it was about my apartment, maybe delayed repairs. Instead, he told me someone had contacted him directly and offered $500 to end my lease early. Not next month, not at the end of the term. Early, fast, with a deadline that made my stomach drop. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a mistake. It was my sister. When I called her, she didn't sound shocked or guilty. She sounded entertained, like she was telling a story she couldn't wait to repeat at dinner. Her message was simple. She said she was doing it for my own good. If I didn't like it, I should figure things out myself. The worst part wasn't the money. It was realizing how quickly my life could be rearranged by people who claimed they loved me, and how calm they were while doing it. By the next afternoon, the situation got uglier even faster. Paperwork moved. Timelines tightened. I realized I had far less leverage than I thought. So I stopped arguing. I stopped pleading. I said nothing, hung up, and made one phone call. Almost immediately, everything changed. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. What time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious how far this story travels. To understand how all of this could happen, you need to know what it was like growing up in my family. On paper, we looked like any other family in a quiet Las Vegas neighborhood. In reality, our roles were set long before I was old enough to notice. I was the kid who handled things, the one teachers never worried about. My older sister, Blair, was the center of everything. If Blair had a game, a rehearsal, or a new obsession, the entire week bent around her schedule. My younger brother, Corey, was the baby who got away with almost everything as long as he kept people laughing. My mom liked to joke that she had a star, a helper, and a comedian. She didn't mean it cruelly, but it explained exactly where I stood. My dad worked long hours and came home ready to hear about Blair's latest big thing. I learned early that if I wanted time with him, I had to wait until she finished telling her stories. It started small. Projects I was proud of were pushed aside because Blair had a tournament coming up. I'd mention something from class and my dad would nod, then turn and ask Blair about practice. When Corey cracked a joke, everyone turned toward him. When I spoke, people used the moment to refill drinks or clear plates. None of it was dramatic enough to point at and call unfair. But those quiet choices taught me that my news always came second. So I stopped competing. I stopped trying to match Blair's performances or Corey's antics. I became the one who fixed problems before anyone noticed them. If a form needed signing, I made sure it was on the table. If the internet went down, I reset the router. If my parents forgot an appointment, I reminded them. The more responsible I became, the less anyone really looked at me. They loved the results, not the person producing them. I became reliable, not a daughter with a life of her own. In high school, I rarely shared anything unless a teacher forced a parent conference. Blair, 3 years older, always had an audience. Coaches, choir directors, and neighbors gushed over her, and my parents glowed with pride. At the grocery store, people asked about Blair's latest achievement, then laughed at Corey's jokes. I only surfaced if someone pushed for more. I told myself I didn't need the spotlight. I leaned into the one thing that was mine, solving problems quietly. I found my way into a field where the work mattered more than who did it, where results could speak for themselves. That fit perfectly with the version of me my family had trained. Step in quietly, fix things, leave before anyone notices. Years moved that way. Birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings followed the same pattern. Blair set the tone. Corey floated through with charm. I kept everything running. When I shared a win, it landed like a small polite detail before attention shifted back to whatever Blair had going on that week. The opportunity for a national award appeared quietly at first, so quietly that it didn't feel real. I received an email from a committee asking for more information about a project my team had completed. I answered their questions and went straight back to work. They wrote again later, saying I'd been shortlisted. Even then, I didn't rush to tell my parents. I already knew how the conversation would go, so I kept it to myself while the process played out. The calls started after that. Interviews. Long forms asking me to explain why our work mattered. People from different organizations spoke with my boss and collaborators who had seen the impact up close. Step by step, things moved forward, but at home, I stayed quiet. The official invitation arrived one afternoon while I was between meetings. It spelled everything out: the ceremony date, the venue, the fact that it would be filmed and broadcast. My name sat there in a way I had never seen before. It wasn't something that could be brushed aside as a small private win. I stared at that email for a long time. For the first time in years, this was something my family couldn't easily minimize. Whether they cared or not, the moment existed. For a brief stretch of time, it was just mine. By the time that invitation landed in my inbox, my work had already been quietly reshaping my life for years. I had ended up in emergency communications because it was a place where my habit of picking everything apart could actually become an asset. I joined a small team building software for cities, tools designed to shave seconds off response times when people called for help. My part was the routing engine. I worked on the piece that tracked traffic patterns, hospital capacity, and call histories, then suggested where each ambulance should go next. In a city like Las Vegas, the lights never really go out. Sirens don't stop. A few seconds can be the difference between a scare and a tragedy. Most of what I did lived inside code repositories. No one outside the building would ever see it. I spent late nights scrolling through call logs and sensor feeds, looking for strange patterns that slowed crews down. When the system worked, there were no headlines, no speeches. A dispatcher's screen lit up with a clean recommendation. A crew reached the right door sooner. Life kept moving. The first person who treated my work more than background noise was Dr. Selma Rhodes, the director of our research group. She noticed that I volunteered for the ugliest data sets, the tangled cases that made other people's eyes glaze over. Instead of telling me to relax, she pulled me into conversations about system architecture and failure modes. She said, out loud, that my need to understand every detail was a strength. Under her guidance, our project started as a quiet pilot in one part of the city. When the software went live, numbers inside the department began to shift. Average response times dipped. Fewer calls bounced between stations. Dispatchers sent short notes after rough weekends saying they felt less helpless. I read every message. I fixed what broke. We rolled the system out farther, quarter by quarter, until the maps covered the entire valley. The nomination for the award didn't even come from our office. A regional data coordinator pulled numbers from the past year, built charts showing how many people reached care faster, and sent the full packet to a national committee that tracked public safety innovations. I didn't even know my name was in the conversation until Selma asked me to step into a conference room one afternoon and close the door. She told me the committee wanted to speak to the person who designed the core routing engine. Every arrow in their documents pointed to me. There would be interviews, she said. The review process would be long. Mostly, I'd hear about it secondhand. My first instinct was to wave it off. In my head, I was still just writing code, following the same pattern I always had, doing the thing no one else wanted to sit with for hours. Selma didn't let me stay there. She reminded me of overnight shifts watching dashboards live. Of the weekend I spent tracing a stubborn bug until a dispatcher called in tears because the new system had moved a crew into position just in time. If recognition came, she said, it wouldn't be about clever math. It would be about refusing to walk away from a problem until it behaved. The review stretched on for months. The committee sent lists of questions that forced me to explain our work in plain language. They asked for timelines, anonymized call data, and explanations of what it meant in human terms for an ambulance to arrive a few minutes sooner on a busy weekend night. At the office, we kept shipping updates and handling incidents while the decision sat somewhere far above us. It was easier to focus on the next deployment than to imagine a room full of people with my name on their agenda. Then the official email arrived. I read it twice before it made sense. The federal agency seal sat at the top of the page. The message said I had been selected to receive the National Public Safety Innovation Award. The ceremony would be held in a downtown hotel ballroom. The program would be recorded and broadcast as part of a larger event honoring different kinds of public service. There was a line about bringing guests, a note about possible media interest, and a link to a thick schedule packed with security instructions. For a day, I kept the news inside our building. I forwarded the email to Selma and my manager. People stopped by my desk with stunned smiles and awkward high fives. Someone printed the invitation and taped it to the break room fridge. Our team lead joked about practicing posture in case the camera panned across our row. Selma squeezed my shoulder and said quietly that the award didn't change who I was. What it meant, she said, was that people outside were finally being forced to see what I had been doing in plain sight all along. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the packet spread out in front of me, the guest section stopped feeling theoretical. On the middle page, a simple sentence stood out. You may invite up to 4 family members or friends. I stared at those words long enough for the ice in my drink to melt. I pictured the empty chairs under my name. I pictured my parents and Blair under the neon glow of the strip, completely unaware of what was happening across town. Part of me wanted to keep the whole thing to myself, the way I treated every other win that never fit neatly into their idea of a big deal. Another part of me, the smallest and angriest one, wanted them to see it, to understand, whether they cared or not. By the time the desert sky had gone fully dark, I'd made up my mind. I opened our family chat, carefully wrote out the invitation, and sent it before I could shrink it into something they could ignore. The night of the ceremony arrived faster than I expected. Late that afternoon, I was in a downtown hotel room, standing in front of a full-length mirror while a stylist pinned the edge of my dark dress into place. The invitation called for formal wear, the kind of polished look I'd only ever seen in news segments and fundraising galas. Under the soft room lights, I barely recognized myself. I wondered if people might stop and stare for a moment before moving on. Downstairs, the event was already unfolding. Security badges, check-in tables, printed programs, all of it turned the lobby into a controlled maze. Staff members in headsets moved clusters of guests between rooms. Every person there represented a service category: public health, education, infrastructure, emergency response. My name sat in the middle section of the program, tucked between people I'd only ever read about in briefings. I moved through the motions the organizers had taught us during rehearsal. Meet the coordinator. Hand over your phone while they confirm details. Pose for a quick photo in front of a banner crowded with logos. Accept your badge, your name printed neatly with the word honoree beneath it. A staff member led me into the ballroom where cameras waited, tripods silent and aimed. The room felt unreal. Round tables filled the floor, each marked with small cards. A low stage ran along the far wall, a simple podium centered beneath it. Overhead, 3 large screens hung like extra walls, ready to display names, footage, and the live feed everyone kept mentioning. I knew one of those screens would hold my face later. I also knew exactly who wouldn't be sitting in the rows beneath it. Our section sat near the middle of the room. Selma joined me there, steady in a plain black suit, completely unfazed by the glitter around us. Members of my team filtered in with wide eyes, squeezing my shoulder, bumping into chairs as they took their seats. For a few quiet minutes, the room's noise faded. All I could feel was the weight of the moment pressing in from every side. The program began with speeches from officials who had made this kind of stage their second home. They talked about service, sacrifice, and the invisible work that keeps cities functioning. I listened with half my attention. The other half kept trying not to picture my parents and Blair walking through the doors. I tried not to imagine empty seats beside my colleagues. I'd sent the message. They had made their choice. Tonight wasn't about empty chairs. When the emergency services category came up, my attention snapped back into the room. A short video played on the screens, showing dispatchers at their consoles, crews weaving through traffic, satellite grids lighting up the city at night. The narrator explained what our software did in careful, broad strokes. My name appeared once. Clean. Neutral. Selma's elbow brushed mine. The host read from a card describing how the routing system had shortened average ambulance response times across the Las Vegas Valley. He talked about lives reached sooner, about seconds mattering when people dial for help. Then he said my full name and asked me to come to the stage. Walking to the podium felt like moving underwater. Applause rose and blurred into a single sound. The stage lights erased the edges of the crowd, leaving only flashes and shapes. I accepted the glass plaque, shook hands with someone whose title I knew but whose face didn't quite feel real yet. A photographer caught the moment I smiled without fully believing it was happening. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a smaller scene played out. I could almost see my family at a concert across town, already in their seats, the band finishing a song. I imagined concourse screen cycling ads before briefly cutting to a news segment showing me standing on that stage. My face flashing between beer commercials and tour dates. My name printed at the bottom of a feed they'd never bothered to ask about. When I stepped away from the podium and returned to my table, the rest of the program continued around me like a film I'd already seen. More names. More applause. More stories of work that usually stayed out of sight. My phone, silent in my bag, buzzed once as the building picked the signal back up. Somewhere else in the city, on another set of screens, my family finally saw the thing they'd been too busy to attend. After the program ended, cameras powered down and the ballroom emptied into soft echoes and clinking glassware. I collected my phone from the check-in table and felt it vibrating non-stop in my hand, the screen lighting up faster than I could clear notifications. Most alerts were expected. Messages from coworkers, emails from city officials, a long thread in our operations channel where someone had dropped a blurry screenshot of me on stage. Beneath those were dozens of missed calls and a flood of unread texts from the same 4 numbers in the family thread. The timestamp on the first burst lined up perfectly with the hour the concert would have taken its break. I opened the chat and let the scroll bar jump. At the top sat my invitation, small and quiet. Under it was my sister's reply dismissing the award as a pointless errand, my parents siding with her. Below that, the tone shifted hard. Mom's messages came in anxious blocks, talking about the giant arena screens, people turning to stare when my name appeared. Dad wrote about strangers asking if they were related to me, adding comments about how proud they felt now, how unbelievable it all was. Blair's texts were shorter, clipped, full of exclamation marks that made everything feel like a performance for an invisible crowd. I read every message slowly. They described the noise in the venue when the clip from the ceremony appeared, the way nearby fans tried to take photos of the broadcast, the questions that followed when my name and job title appeared under my image. Not one message mentioned that they had chosen a concert over being in the room. They wrote about shock, pride, disbelief, like the only thing that mattered was how dramatic the reveal had been. For a moment, an old reflex flared, the instinct to smooth things over, to make everyone feel better. I could almost hear myself typing reassurances, explaining the project in simple terms, shifting focus away from what they'd done and toward how exciting the future looked. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard while the familiar conversation played out in my head. Instead, I locked the screen and lowered the phone. My team was waiting back at the table, caught between celebration and the tiredness that follows a long campaign. Selma lifted an eyebrow when she saw my face, my grip on the phone. I shook my head once, not ready to unpack it, and let myself be pulled into the practical end-of-night tasks, finishing the group photo, thanking the organizers, figuring out which rideshare line to stand in outside the hotel. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had quieted. I set the plaque on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and finally opened my phone again. The unread badges had multiplied. Alongside the family thread were messages from distant relatives, old classmates, neighbors from the cul-de-sac where I grew up. Links to news clips sat under captions about how wild it was to see my face on the strip during a night out. Back in the family chat, the tone had shifted again. The first frantic shock cooled into something more calculated. Mom asked if local news might want to talk to them about what it was like to raise a daughter so dedicated. Dad wondered out loud whether the city would be interested in a story about the neighborhood I came from. Blair floated the idea of posting a throwback photo of us as kids with a caption about always believing in her little sister. I scrolled until I reached the point where their new plan sat directly above the lines where they'd brushed off the invitation. I took screenshots and saved them to a folder only I would recognize. I didn't reply. The gap between what they were saying now and what they'd said before didn't feel like something a late-night message could close. Outside my window, the strip glowed in its usual colors, indifferent to who had cheered in ballrooms or concert halls that night. Inside my living room, for the first time in a long while, I let myself sit with the truth of what their words actually meant. Morning arrived without asking what kind of day I wanted it to be. I woke to sunlight slipping past the blinds and the faint vibration of my phone on the nightstand. For a second, I imagined it was just the usual stream of work emails, another cycle of small problems needing quiet fixes. Then I saw the same cluster of names at the top of the screen, senders I hadn't spoken to in years. I set the phone face down and made coffee first. My apartment felt fragile, something I needed to protect before letting other people's reactions in. When the mug was warm in my hands, I sat at the table and unlocked the phone. Reporters had already started circling. 2 local stations asked for interviews. A regional outlet wanted to film at our office. Our communications team sent a note reminding me I didn't have to say yes to every camera pointed my way. Beneath that thread, the family chat icon still glowed. When I opened it again, the pattern overnight was clear. After the initial shock, my parents had moved straight into planning. Which relatives to call? Which neighbors would be most impressed? Which journalist might want footage of the street where I grew up? Blair's messages read like drafts of public posts, polished nostalgia, claims about always knowing I was bound for something big. Corey added a few scattered reactions, trying to balance without picking a side. I scrolled until I reached the blank line at the bottom. Anything I wrote there would be reread and folded into whatever story they told about us. The difference now was that I finally understood how much access they had to the version of me the world had just met. I typed slowly, checking each line before letting it stand. I kept it short. I acknowledged that the ceremony had been a big moment. Yes, it was strange seeing my face on screens in places I'd never set foot in. Then I drew the boundary. I said I didn't want interviews framed around our home life. I wouldn't participate in features about my childhood. Any story I agreed to tell would focus on the work and the people who depended on it. I also said it hurt watching them scramble to benefit from something they'd been dismissive of hours earlier. I didn't quote their replies. I didn't need to. The scroll history was there. I finished by asking them not to contact my coworkers or anyone in my department, and by saying that if a reporter approached them, I hoped they would choose honesty over image. When I hit send, the typing indicator appeared almost immediately, flickering on and off as if no one could decide who should speak first. Eventually, my mom's reply arrived. It was a tight block of text trying to cover every angle at once. She insisted they were just excited, proud in their own way, that I was overthinking things like I always did. My dad's response came next. Shorter, sharper. He wrote that I shouldn't tell them how to talk about their own daughter, that they had sacrificed plenty over the years, and that he didn't appreciate being made to feel like a villain on a night that should have been a celebration. Blair didn't send a paragraph at all. She fired off several short messages instead, each one sharper than the last. She accused me of being ungrateful, of trying to embarrass them, of acting like I had raised myself. Her words landed with less force than they might have a year earlier. Instead of reshaping how I saw what had happened, they sounded like echoes from a room I'd already stepped out of. I read them all. I waited to see if any part of me wanted to jump back into the familiar argument about who had done what for whom. What I felt instead was a tired kind of clarity. I closed the chat without replying and opened an email from our communications team again. Attached was a short media guide about boundaries, about not feeling obligated to share details that made you uneasy, about keeping the focus on the work. Near the end was a line about how people closest to us are sometimes the least prepared for public attention, and how it's okay to enforce distance. Reading those words, I realized I didn't have to wait for anything to change. Distance wasn't punishment. It was orientation. I went back to the family thread one last time and muted it for a full year. Then I opened individual conversation windows and switched alerts off, one by one. Messages could still arrive if they sent them. My home would stay quiet unless I chose otherwise. The weeks that followed didn't feel like a victory lap. They felt like a reset. At work, the award became a kind of shorthand. New people joined the team already knowing my name. Sometimes strangers showed up with cameras. Dispatchers stopped me in hallways to share small details I'd never see on a dashboard. A child who reached the hospital before a seizure spiraled. An elderly neighbor who didn't spend the night alone on the floor because a crew arrived fast enough to help her up. Selma used the attention to push for more funding, more staff, more stubborn people who hated unsolved problems as much as I did. Inside that momentum, my personal life rearranged itself around quieter choices. I kept my phone number but removed the family thread from my home screen. I went to dinner with coworkers who had become friends, people who knew how much the project cost and didn't need me to shrink it to make them comfortable. I met visiting students, answered their questions about burnout and purpose, and told them plainly that the work mattered more than any headline. Old pieces of my life still slipped through sometimes. A mutual acquaintance would mention that my parents had framed a news clipping and hung it in their living room. Someone from back home would message that my mom talked about me nonstop at neighborhood gatherings, always skipping the part where she skipped the ceremony. Once, a distant cousin forwarded a long email my dad had written about raising a daughter who never needed much from us, framing distance as pride. I read those updates the way you read a weather report for a city you no longer plan to visit. Blair tried a different route. When I didn't respond in the group chat, she started tagging me in old photos online, writing sentimental captions about always believing in her little sister. I sent her one direct message, the first in months, stating clearly that I didn't want our relationship presented that way. I told her if it continued, would block her everywhere and involve our department's legal team if necessary. She removed the tags. She kept posting, just without my name. The consequences weren't dramatic confrontations or public scenes. They were closed doors. Parents who bragged but couldn't reach me directly. A sister who performed nostalgia for an audience but couldn't rewrite what had actually happened. A brother who stayed on the fence as long as he could. The path back into my daily life had been cut the night they decided a concert mattered more than showing up. I stayed open in the parts of my life I chose intentionally. I kept working on the routing system and the projects that followed. I mentored interns who reminded me of the version of myself who once sat in a bedroom teaching a computer to listen. I joined review groups to study near misses, not because any committee might notice, but because somewhere at the other end of a call, a stranger was waiting. And that was enough. Thanks so much for watching. If this story hit close to home, you're not alone. Stories like this happen quietly, every day, in families that look normal from the outside. If you've ever been overlooked, minimized, or taken for granted, this channel is for you. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to Revenge Reloaded, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. More of our most gripping stories are already on your screen right now. Click one and keep watching. You won't want to miss what comes next.